Okay, so the idea here is to take some pretty straightforward information. Your line drawing as one of those layers, right? In Photoshop, we're going to be asking you to deal with and work with a series of layers. So one of them should just be your drawing, right? And in this case, this is coming right from Rhino, but you can think of it as analogous to your trace paper. This is not the clear, or the white background is not clear. So that's actually on the image, so you can't see through it. So that's one solid image, and the idea is to work with the layering tools, working with hand drawing, working with what you're able to achieve with Rhino to cast shadows, to add some tonality, and also other textures that you can bring to the table to get something like this to hopefully be something a little bit more like that. So the idea here too is not necessarily to, when I was working on this image, I wasn't trying for a photorealistic goal, right? I was actually wanting there to the hand to be present in the image, some kind of speculation to be there in the image. It wasn't necessarily about depicting it exactly how it would be in the physical world, but more so telling the story about what's going on with this as an idea. And so adding the vegetation, it's a little bit more sort of gestural. Obviously scale people or entourage for to add scale to the overall image. You know, add a sky to give it a little bit of depth, so this is really sitting on the ground and so forth. So I just wanted to walk through a few of these steps to start to build up a hybrid rendering like this, starting with a simple drawing like this. So I'm going to go ahead and just start with this. You can see I have here layered image, and I actually ended up cropping it from this overall landscape to this. And that's something that can happen later as you start to frame it up. But starting with an image like this, and one thing to keep in mind as well is to think about the drawing, think about the model in Rhino as a series of layers. One layer in this case is the actual intervention. Another layer would be the intervention in context. You can see that there is context in this other image. And the layers, and this may look like a whole lot of layers, it is a lot of layers, but once you find a logic for what it is that you're trying to achieve, it starts to make sense, not only how to place these, how to relate them, but also how to name some of the files, the layers accordingly, so you can keep track of what image is doing what in the overall image. And even some of the naming conventions that I created here probably could be a little bit more refined, just so you can really keep track. Once you have a lot of layers working here and you want to tweak one thing or the other, you need to be able to go to the masked image, and maybe that needed to be called a masked image, or go to an image that's just about an overlay in terms of the layering and so forth. So you could get deeper in terms of layer management, but in general, this is the way I started to work with it. In particular, I wanted to keep the idea of the image or the intervention on its own as a distinction. So that's what the solo layers come into play. And then there are the others that are, I think in this case, just called all. All to me meant that included the intervention and also included the context. So in starting with this, you can see here that this is just a solo image. So this will be the main one that I'll start building from in this case. Right now, the layer is just background, so I'll go ahead and change that. And I'll just call it Solo 1. And then I'm actually going to also call it Lines. Just because I want to make a distinction between the solo image, the line work, and the solo image that I might bring that has shadow and some tonality from Rhino as being distinct. So I'll say OK. So all of those, or that image that I created, this one, or I guess this final one, was essentially created from some of these images, not all of them. There's a few night shots here that weren't used. but mostly these images, which you can see, are basically the line drawings. So the line drawings that came from Rhino, and those have a variation in terms of their tonality. There are some PNG here with the blank background. I didn't use, let's see. So this is actually one that I used the capture tool in Rhino, and so it took out the background. I didn't end up using that for this. I could have. I ended up just working with the other. So that's why this is all black background, because there is no background. It's just that line work. So there are those sets, and then these renders here was just a simple render with a shadow cast. That's a night shot that's for a night shot I won't talk about. Another one with context. So there's one drawing or two drawings for each sort of category. Two drawings for the solo that include the context and doesn't include the context, and the same for the renders coming from Rhino, with and without context. So it was those images and these others that I just grabbed from the internet. So I have that open here. So if you just do a search on, for example, trees PNG, you're going to find a bunch of images here that are tree images that already have a transparent background. They have no background, right? So you can bring those in to work with fairly quickly. You want to be careful with some of the sources, of course. Mind your viruses. I did the same for grass. So I just typed in a search for grass PNG. So there's a lot to work with here. And also for entourage. If you just type in people, silhouette, PNG, I'm sure there are other ways to search it. You have a lot of options in terms of bringing in imagery for this. So that's where I grabbed these images. The other entourage, the figures, are actually ones that I had used in another project. I just kind of keep recycling. The same people are in all the projects, right? They travel. Okay, so starting with this image, I'm going to close this out. We'll just start layering this overall. In particular, I want to layer the rendered image from Rhino right over this. And when you bring images in, so I want to make sure I have the Ground 5 Solo. Like that. So there's an adjustment working with a smaller window. Okay. So when I bring this in, I could just put it right into the image file that I'm already working on, right? But what Photoshop will do is it'll place that in as a smart object, and I won't necessarily be able to touch it up. Like if I wanted to erase something that was a fragment in the distance, or just kind of tweak it intuitively using erase tool or whatever other tools in Photoshop, I would actually have to, if I just placed it in here, let's go ahead and drag it in. It's going to ask me to place. I'll have to scale this up so it matches. So I would do that until it works. But once it's in, and I go to layers, you'll see there's this extra little box, which means it's a smart object. So in order to like erase anything, so if I go to the erase tool, you see there's a little I can't do that symbol, which basically means I have to double click on this, it'll open up on another file, then I have to do my editing there. That may be fine for you, but for me it's just an extra step that I really didn't want to deal with, because just when you're working with this, sometimes you're turning layers on and off, you want to make quick changes, and if you have to go out and open it up in another file and then tweak it there, the process to me just starts to get a bit too laborious. So instead of that, what I tend to do, I'm just going to delete that. Go back to the image, and I'm going to drag this into the top bar until it says copy. So that's just going to, oops, I shouldn't have done that. It's good this is open. Basically, I just want to open this up in Photoshop. So you can right click and say open, or I just drag it to that tab bar, and then it'll open it up as a separate file. Then I could just drag this down, and if my layers are open, and I'm actually looking at the layer for this image down here below, I can just take this layer and drag it over into the other file. And then I can close this out. And now I can just work with this as an image. So of course you have to scale this, which can be a little tedious, and I know it's going to be more tedious with this small screen resolution. But basically I'll just have to go into transform, scale, until this matches up. This is why it's a little bit more difficult to do depending on your outputting some of this imagery. To mind your resolution, because then they all match up, obviously you don't have to go through this. Hold my shift key down to keep proportions matching, and then it's the process of tweaking it until I think it's reasonable. I'm going to go ahead and enter that. I'm going to go back into my layers and throw it behind, well, that won't work, behind the line, but I'll give the line some transparency so I can see through it, just so I can scale this. I usually just keep that layer panel open because I don't have much screen. I can't do that. Here, edit, transform, scale, and then for this one I've just been trying to line that up. Sometimes you can just nudge it with your arrow tools. I'm holding my Alt key down in the scroll so that I can zoom in and out pretty quickly that way. See, it's not quite matching up. The other corner is closer to one of the controls, so I'll try to do that. And this is just trial and error. This isn't going to be perfect, but I'm just going to try to get close. So that's close-ish. Typically I would make sure it was fairly exact. Okay, so now I have that first layer. Enter to accept that. Okay, now I can go back to the layer. I want that render actually to be on top of the line work. Let me bring this opacity back up. And again, this is how I'm kind of going through it. I'm just showing you a kind of workflow. The actual order or what it is that you're looking for may vary, so you don't have to do this exactly, but you should be using these basic layers, context, without context, the lines, the rendering, and entourage, and then use some of these other tools to achieve certain goals. I mean, part of this too is just establishing what all the files are going to be, and also try to identify what the reading of the image wants to be based off your ideas of the project, right? This is all about the project, and so if it's a ominous kind of gesture, which is I think the one on here was kind of an ominous sky, and it was a little bit more sketchy. That was just maybe the mood I was in, I don't know. But also was relative to the project. So you want to think about the nature of the project in terms of then transitioning and transcending into the way these images will read. Okay, this says layer 1 right now. I'm going to go ahead and change that to solo 1, and I'm going to say, I'll just say render. So I know align's different than render. Now, one thing that I know I'm going to want to do is include a sky in this somehow, right? And I want to start working with that. I mean, I choose to work with that a little bit earlier than later. Rather than, I mean, you could search skies just like you search for the others, but I'm going to use this other sky quickly, at least the background of it. drag it over into this. Here's this guy. And I'm going to drag it to where I want it to be. Obviously right now I can't see the sky, right? And so one of the first things that you want to do, and it's a little bit different from this image, the render I output as a PNG file, so there's no background, right? So I don't have much of a problem seeing the sky. But your line drawing and your scan of your line drawing may be differently. And so there are a few different ways that you might think about using a clipping mask. One, or actually it's just called a layer mask here. And it's a tool that's down below on the layer panel itself. And you'll see FX, which means these are different effects. Layer effects. There's a layer mask, a general sort of adjustment layer where you can adjust like the contrast and brightness, that sort of thing. You can create folders in a new file and obviously delete layers. So what I actually do, if I want to create a mask, and with the idea of the layer mask, you want to actually have selected the area you want to keep. Everything else then will be eliminated. So you want to select the actual mask itself. If I do that just with this image, it's a little bit difficult because I basically want everything around all in here. And in terms of a selection, I'm just using the wand tool. I could get all of that around, but it's not going to give me these other little areas. So then I would have to select similar. And then it's going to give me other areas that I don't want. So you can see how messy it can get pretty quickly. Just Control D for deselect. Now I could select this and then just go in and add these areas, but it depends on the complexity of the image and the complexity of what it is that we're seeing through it. There's a lot of columns that could be kind of tedious. So I'm actually going to deselect that. In this case, I'm going to actually use this previous, or the rendered image, to actually make the selection. So I'm on that image and I'm going to use my wand tool again. And there's material where, through these objects here that I know then won't be selected. And I also know that this is absolutely clear. And so there's a pretty clear distinction between what's going to be included and excluded. So I can go ahead and select similar. And more or less that should be fine. And then I'll go and switch back to the other layer. I can actually turn this off. Now I selected everything that's around the object, and I actually want to select the inverse of that, right? I actually want to keep the image, otherwise the image will be excluded. So I'll right click, select inverse. Now I just have the object selected, and then I could go ahead into the bottom of the layer dialog box and select layer mask. So now I can just see through that image, and it's actually something that I could edit or what have you. If you wanted to get a little bit more detailed, like say for example you just wanted the line work from your drawing, you could create a mask of that as well. So I'll just Control Z that and just show you a quick example. I'm going to zoom in here, and then I will make the selection and right click, select similar, and I could broaden the tolerance here too if I wanted to include a little bit more tonality. And I'll right click similar. Now more or less selected all of the line work, and I could simply create a mask from that. So I'll go back to the mask tool down here below. So now it's just more or less the line work or whatever was in that range of tone, and you can tweak that tolerance if you want more to include more or less. In this case though, I wanted to keep, select some of this tonality that's in here, and that may be part of your trace paper or maybe something, but it gives it a little bit of tooth, it gives it a little bit of texture, lets us know that it's a drawing more or less. So I'm going to actually use the other technique. I was on the wrong layer. Select similar. Now on this layer I want to create the mask. Oops, see, that's what happens if you select the wrong area. So Control Z, I have to inverse that selection. That's what I want to keep. There we go. And now the sky is obviously at a wrong scale. So again, it's just tweaking the position of this. And you know, for this image, the sky was okay. So I can bring that up. I can actually even distort it a little bit if I wanted to match it up. Right now it kind of looks like just a backdrop. It doesn't really look like it belongs to this image. And so one thing that you can help to mitigate that is to start to maybe rotate or work with that image so the perspectives start to make sense with each other. Either they're really counter or they go along with it in some cases. The scale of the sky you want to be careful of as well. I don't know, in this case we'll see how this starts to work depending on the other images. I know I have a building right back here, so I'm not going to see all of this or what's down at the base. So I'll leave that there for now. And I'll bring in some of the context images. Okay, so where is it? Here's one. This one has context. Oops. And I'm going to go ahead and bring the other one in right away too, which is the lines with context. I believe it was this one. Okay, so same process. I can just drag this down. I'm going to go over to the image that I'm working on, make sure I have layers out, and bring that over. Oop, I have to open it up first, double click on it, unlock it. So then it's a process too of scaling, and this should match up a little bit better. Again, that's layer 1, so I want to make sure this is, I'm just going to call it context 1 lines. So I think that matches up pretty well because it was the same scale as the other lines drawing. And I'm going to bring in that other image. This one I know I'm going to have to scale. You can see that this image is coming in really small. And that's actually somewhat of a problem. Typically, I would start with this image because this is actually a decent resolution and layer in the other images to that. So the line drawings would be huge when I brought them in. I would actually scale them down. So you want to make sure you're not going from small and then blowing this up. But instead of starting this over, I'll just tell you that as a note. And I'm not necessarily looking for crispness out of these drawings. And so while it's still relative, you don't want to lower the resolution by stretching it out. I know that eventually I'm not going to see all the details in this, so it's not a huge deal, but if I discovered that I was doing this as I was working through it, I would probably just go ahead and start over with the smaller image and then bring everything else down so I was working at the right scale and resolution. Okay, so scale this puppy. And if you were really, I've done this a few different ways where I've just have tweaked the percentage, because you can actually, when you scale up above, you can scale by a percentage, the height and width right here, so you can link these and say 323%. So that way, if you sync that in, then automatically you know what the others are going to be. So instead of scaling this up and down, and you've already figured it out for one, you know it's going to be 253%. So you just type that in, and then it'll be scaled correctly. But I haven't figured that out for this. So I have to do it the manual way. I'm holding my shift key down to keep everything in proportion. And I'm just trying to get close here. Okay, so for this I'm going to say that's okay. All right, so similar issue with this, right? I have the white background that I want to get rid of, so I'm going to go ahead and create another mask. And I'll actually end up cropping this overall image to where the rendered image line is, so I'm not too worried about these bands above and below. So I'll go into layers. I'll rename the layer I just brought in, context 1 render. So select on that layer, make sure I'm zoomed all the way out, get the wand tool, and I'll select similar, and then select the inverse, back to the other layer, and create the mask. So I'm not worried about these getting cropped off, because I know I'm going to eventually just crop it down to that size. But now I have the sky through, it's okay, I could still tweak that sky a little bit. But for now, I think it's okay just to work with it and start getting into the other bits of imagery. And maybe just to make things easier overall, I'm just going to go ahead and crop this now. I'm actually going to bring this in a little bit, bring that in a little bit, enter. Oops, I forgot the bottom. Now these trees I had rendered using Flamingo, so that was just legacy from that plugin. That's a plugin for Rhino, one of their rendering engines. But I'll also show you just how to add some trees. Okay, so now we have all these layers. I'm going to start working with the top two, just the solo intervention layers. And what I'm going to do initially, and if I zoom in on this, you can see it's even that render isn't the best, right? It looks a little bit cartoony. Just enough to get an impression of tonality. So what I'm going to go ahead and do are use one of the blending tools here. And so this drop down where it says normal, there are a series of different options. So I can really then have whatever layer is on top and whatever layers is selected here, affect the layers below in some particular ways. The ones I tend to use a lot are overlay and sometimes darken. It's overlay, darken, and sometimes screen. So I'm going to go ahead and select the overlay. So you can see it just started to give it a little bit of a gestural quality, right? It took that image and automatically started to blend it over the other in order to give it a little bit of depth. It's still pretty washed out overall, which is why what I would then do, I'll right click on this layer and I'm going to actually duplicate that layer, and I'll just say fine, it's a copy. And instead of the overlay, I'm just going to put it back to normal, and I'm just going to bring the opacity down and work with it that way. So there's enough depth there, there's enough tonality, but it's still fairly speculative. It's still, definitely a drawing layered with some other things. So, for now that looks okay-ish. And I'm going to go ahead and do the same for the others here. So this, now I know I'm going to want to duplicate it anyway, so I'm just going to go ahead and duplicate that. This will be the overlay. See how it's affecting it there. You can also, if it's using the blending tool, you can still toggle the opacity of it so you can see how it's affecting that image. And this still set at normal, and I'll just wash it out a little bit, maybe at 35%. So you can start to see that something else is happening with the image already, right? Something is we're starting to see these layers through each other. We're starting to get a kind of sense of there's a tactile quality to what's happening here. And that's really what I'm trying to achieve. I'm going to go ahead and create another layer. Now this still looks pretty stiff to me. And so I want to give it a little bit of tooth. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to take this layer, I'm going to make another copy of it, duplicate layer. And now I'm going to apply a filter to it to give it some texture. And I would encourage you when you're working with this, and once you have the image sort of set and you don't want to erase any more of it, that sort of thing, at that point, I think it's okay then to convert it to a smart object. And the reason why I like smart objects after you've done that preliminary editing is that you can go back or turn off or change the filters that you're applying to the images. You're not sort of locked into that, once you apply it. So if I would go ahead and filter a blur or a sketch or some other quality, it would just burn in without first converting it to for a smart filter, smart object. So you can see it has that little window again there. But now I can go into the filters, and in this case I'm going to go into the filter gallery. And what I've been using a lot, and you can play around with some of these, is chalk and charcoal. Oops. And I want to cancel that, and actually I want to go back because I already screwed up. One thing you want to keep tabs of, and I'm going to go back before I converted it to a smart object, and if you'll notice this layer that I just made that copy of, it's at 65% opacity, and so that's then going to be baked in if I convert it to a smart object. So I want to actually have more control than that, so I'm going to make sure it's 100 first. So otherwise you can't go back. The other thing with some of the the filter tools that I was just showing you, it's relative to the what you have as the foreground color and the background color here. So I'm going to make sure I have black and white because I actually want to get some of those strokes to be part of the image. Now I'll go back, convert it. And then I will go into the filter gallery. Should look a little bit different this time. And you can play around with the charcoal area, the chalk area. I mean, for any of these, there are different options. And I'm not looking for anything that looks too overly processed, right? I'm just actually looking for the texture. And so this starts to be kind of deep. It gives a little bit of depth. I like those strokes, so I'm going to go with that. This is also relative to the resolution of the image. So this is actually one advantage of working bigger, is that the strokes in this case are going to be much smaller. If the resolution was smaller, then you're going to notice the strokes actually be bigger, and they actually start to look a little bit cartoony. So I'm going to go ahead and accept that. So you can see now with the Smart Layer, I can actually toggle it on and off. And I can add more if I'd like to. But in this case, I'm just going to soften it up a bit. I just want a little bit of texture there, so I don't know, about 25–30%, something like that. And then that's something I also then did for the background layer. And it was, let's see, this render, duplicate layer, okay, 100%, convert it for a smart layer, smart filter rather, boom. I'm going to go ahead and just do the same thing. This is going to be behind everything, and maybe I want that to be a little bit more present. So you can see all those little strokes. That's going to add some nice texture to the image. Then I can play around with the opacity. See, even the vegetation starts to look a little bit less cartoony. Something like that. And actually, that's something I also ended up doing to the sky. It's at 100% already. So it had a blur on it. This previous one had a smart blur on it. But I'm going to delete that filter and add filter gallery. And this is really, your preference. So just make sure that, some of these start to look really kind of silly. So you have to be careful with how you work with it. Something like that. That could be kind of interesting maybe. But I've just been using this one. Another thing that you're able to do with some of these layers is, say at a certain point I just wanted to cast an overall hue. I'm asking you all to work with black, white, and an accent color. And that can mean a variety of things. Maybe there's, a punctuated moment that's, a screaming red or what have you that walks you through the drawings, or it's part of the plan scheme, although it's hard to factor into renderings typically. You can also convert this overall image to a duotone. Let me just show you how to do that quick. Oh, let's take this image. So say I wanted to create a duotone with this image. Didn't want all that color. So I would go into image mode. First I'd convert it to a grayscale. So discard all the color information. Then I would select duotone. So what it's going to do then is select two colors and bring them together, right? Duotone. And so I can select whatever color I want that to be. Right now I'm looking at the Pantones. So maybe, I don't know, I want it to be a little more goldish. So it's kind of like a sepia look to it. So that's fairly easy to do with images. What you can also then do, since they're on top of each other, what you can also do here is create some other effects. So one of the effects is, is that the one? Oh, here it is. This would be an adjustment. Solid color. So then I could select some color that I thought was appropriate. Maybe a little bit more orange. And then I could use the layer effects here as well, so overlay or what have you, to give it a different kind of overall hue. I could do that for the whole image. I can do it sort of layer by layer. Delete that. And then that's very similar to this effects over here. It's color overlay. In this case, it's set to red. So that's some of the other effects that you can kind of work with here. Let's see. So I can just add an overall hue to this. So I'm actually going to use the solid color in this case. Go back to that orangish color. And then apply the overlay. And I could make that just very, very subtle if I wanted to by working then with the opacity. So generally that's how these layers kind of work. And you can see right now that, you know, this is sort of, it's a little bit lost, it's not as punctuated as this other image was. This is a little bit cleaner. And that's going back and working with the layers and their opacities and also the different kinds of effects that are working here. So for example, this is the render. I can pump that up a little bit more. I could also just say, well, maybe I just want to darken the overall intervention, and so I can go down and select from the blending tools here, darken color. So it's a little bit more subtle in terms of how it works, so I can make sure to really punch the intervention image there. Let's see. Is everything making sense so far using some of these tools? The other thing I did with this this image here was bring in some vegetation. So there's already some vegetation there that came from the rendering, but I wanted to add potentially a little bit more. So for now I'm going to turn this off. Actually going to dull that down, give it a little bit more blue tone there. Okay, so all I'm going to do then is go back to those images. I'm going to use this. This actually came as a JPEG, but I just went and deleted all of the background and created a PNG file for that. So I'm going to go through the same steps that I used to bring the other images in. And let's see, where is it? So I'm going to call this, say, Shrubs 1. So now the advantage that I have is that I have the overall intervention in the foreground, and I have the context in the background, and I can start slipping some things in between. And so I could take these shrubs and set it behind the object the intervention. I can also set it behind some of these other layers. So for example, that texture that I added then will then be overlaid onto the shrub, so they won't seem quite so alien to the overall image. Maybe I'll just, for the sake of working with it right now, I'll just keep it there on behind one. So I just want to see what I'm doing a little bit more, so I'll bring it up in terms of its layering. Now I just want to move it. So I'm going to kind of work on this area right here. So first I can just sort of, so I want to add some vegetation to the background there. So I'm just going to go ahead and distort it to kind of fit the perspective. So I'll go into Transform, Distort. So, you know, more or less, make sure you're, you know, understanding your drawing conventions for perspectives and so forth, and trying to follow that. I think the horizon is right about here for this object, so it would start to potentially level out, and maybe that's okay for now. I'm also just going to go ahead and bring down a guide. Because I know this image, I know that the horizon is right around here, fairly close. In your rendering from Rhino, you can set that up like I showed you the other day, where you can either set up an overall line or a rectangle, so you can line that up and make sure you know where that line sits in the perspective. You don't necessarily have to render it, but it's going to tell you approximately, you know, where it is relative to some of these objects, so you know how to place some of these entourage and so forth. But in this image, I think that's pretty close to where it is. Now I'm going to work back over here, and I don't know, maybe I wanted, make sure I'm on the right layer, to add a little bit more vegetation in this area. And you want to be careful using this tool, but I think it's interesting what you can do with it. So I'm just going to, this is the it's called Healing Brush tool, and so there are a couple healing brushes. One is just, you can select an area and it's going to try to sort of use algorithms to fill in that area with what the rest of the image has. Or you can sort of use it more like the stamp tool. If you guys use the stamp tool at all, where you can clone the image, I'll show you the stamp tool. It's just this stamp here. So right now I have a selection, and I had my caps lock on, that's why we see the crosshairs versus this. So I can adjust the size of the brush. But basically where you're going to do is hold your Alt key down, and that's basically going to be a target area. So I can select, like maybe here I wanted the target area, so I just clicked it. And now you can see it's going to carry that over, so I can replicate what that is. But this is exact, it's going to replicate it exactly. So I could kind of, you know, get close with something like that, right? And that's good just for touching up some of those images and so forth. The healing brush tool, now there's one that's spot healing, and I don't think it's going to work very well for this area, but basically what you're able to do, it would probably work good for a sky. But if there was an area that you wanted to, I don't know, in this case heal, but add more of this kind of imagery, I could just sort of brush it in, and it's going to guess what I want to add in there, so it's thinking right now. So it kind of processed and added some green imagery, right? It's kind of clunky that way, so that's why I say it's good for a sky. If you have wispy clouds and that sort of thing, and you wanted to like remove some birds or a telephone pole or something like that, it's good for that, because you can just highlight that area and it's going to use the rest of the image to inform what happens there. This one, you can see it started to kind of get really digitized in a weird way. So I'll Control C out of that. Now the other option here is the Healing Brush tool. And in this case, I can select a target area similar to the stamp tool. So I'll hold my Alt key down. And I'll click. And now I can start filling in this area, but it's not exact to what that other images was, so the sampled images, it's not exact, so it starts to kind of infer a little bit and allow it to have variation. So there's going to be a lot of vegetation here. Okay, so let's work with that. It's kind of clumpy there, but I can also do that now for other areas. So if I wanted to, I could sort of add a little bit of green there. It takes a little while for this to process. Someone's angry about shrub drawing. So if I just wanted to kind of fill that in, that's probably enough. So, I mean, that's pretty lush back there. It's actually only a couple feet wide, so that's probably a little overdone. But you get the idea. You can start to add this, and I could then go back with my erase tool and touch it up a little bit, modify the brush size, maybe to be a little bit bigger, and I want it to be really soft. So I can just start to soften that up a little bit. That's a little bit better. And then I could start to slip it behind some of these other layers. So I know I have this filtered image that has the charcoal on it. Gets a little bit lost there. So maybe I wanted to keep it more so where it was and just play with the opacity. Just a gesture, just a hint that there's some vegetation. I'm not trying to draw specific trees or anything. Just add that texture back there. Can also then add a tree. So this is just a tree I found online. It was already a PNG. I'm not sure what that is referring to, but it seems to work. I mean, I'll give it a name right away. Tree 1. Put it behind the bushes. So maybe I wanted that tree to be back here. So again, working with the scale, make sure it makes sense with the overall image. I have some other trees there for reference, although those are kind of small trees. We change the proportion of it a little bit. So I don't know, maybe that makes some sense. I'm actually going to use my erase tool and just, if I right click, I can also get to the brush sizes and the hardness, these other options. Just gonna make sure that bottom isn't quite so abrupt. And I could sort of soften the edges too if I wanted, just to make sure it blends in with the image a little bit better. And then again, playing with the opacity, we'll sort of blend it in. It's a little saturated as well, so I actually may want to just go ahead and desaturate it. That was probably true with those bushes as well. That looks okay. And maybe I wanted another quick tree, so I'll just duplicate that layer. And go into Edit, Transform. I'll just change the proportion of it. I just mirrored it and perhaps starts to look like a different tree. And I can actually go ahead and erase if I wanted to slip behind that pole. Just do a quick erase. Let's see. So it's kind of just seeing what you need, you know, adding entourage, touching it up, making sure that it makes sense with the overall, you know, the kind of reading again that you're looking for. And also too, the entourage ends up being fairly important. I just have these selected right now. Of course, I could bring others, and depending on, and I actually put these into a folder. So down below you can create a folder here and just add other layers in there, sub-layers to the folder, just to kind of keep this layer management under control a little bit. Especially with entourage, you're dealing with these very little objects in space, and sometimes it's hard to see what is what. So these folks were already kind of set up. Let's see what else I have in here. Oh, there's a guy sitting. So these people are kind of set up already on the horizon line. You can tell this guy sitting down is too high because he's actually hitting the horizon line. These folks too are too high. These are actually from a different rendering. And I just hit my F key to allow me to have a little bit more screen real estate, but also just to always pan. If you don't do that, then it's just a different display type. But if you don't do that, sometimes it gets hard to navigate, especially with a tight screen like this. I don't always use that. Let's see, where was I? Yeah, so I don't think I need those folks. Oh, there's someone up there. That person. It's dangerous. So maybe I'll work with this dude a little bit. Get him to sit on that bench. He's probably too big in scale, so I'm going to scale him down. Yeah, maybe something like that. He's also black instead of white. So I could just go ahead, I should be able to just go ahead and image, I should be able to invert it. Oh, wait. Play with the opacity, make sure I can just see him enough. I don't want it to be too punctuated, right? Because all of a sudden that starts to take away from the reading. There's too much contrast there. So I'm actually just going to dial it down till I just get a hint that that person is there. I get a hint of the scale. It's not they're not overtaking the image at all.